Even if they had asked, Epley wouldn't have known what to say. He hadn't understood himself what was going on inside his head. Not until he had started talking to the counselor, and she, instead of trying to put herself in his shoes, had simply asked him questions that elicited emotional replies. Why are you making these choices? Is this who you want to be? Then she had listened and had asked smart follow-up questions, and that somehow had inspired Epley to start listening to her, and then to himself, until he realized he needed to change. Now, as an adult, Epley wondered if the psychology textbooks had it wrong. Perhaps the correct approach wasn't trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes. That, after all, was impossible. Rather, maybe the best you can do is to ask questions. Ask about people's lives, about what they're feeling, about their hopes and fears, and then listen for their struggles, disappointments, joys, and ambitions. Hearing people describe their emotional lives is important, because when we talk about our feelings, we're describing not just what has happened to us, but why we made certain choices and how we make sense of the world. When you describe how you feel, you're giving someone a map of the things you care about, Epley said. That's why I connected with my parents, because I finally understood what mattered to them. I understood they were scared and worried and just wanted me to be safe. This is why the how do we feel conversation is so crucial. Every discussion is shaped by our emotions. And when we bring those feelings to the surface, when we share them and ask others to share with us, we begin to see how we might align. Epley began thinking that there must be an alternative to perspective taking. Maybe there was a different technique to help people ask the kinds of questions that nudge emotions into the open. Perhaps instead of perspective taking, we ought to be focused on perspective getting, on asking people to describe their inner lives, their values and beliefs and feelings, the things they care about most. Epley sensed there was something about asking questions, the right questions, that contained the seeds of real understanding. But which questions were the right ones? The right questions. In 1995, Elaine and Arthur Aaron, a husband and wife team of research psychologists at the State University of New York Stony Brook, placed 2 chairs atop a bright orange rug in a windowless room and invited strangers in pairs to come in, sit down, and take turns asking each other a list of questions. None of the participants, who eventually numbered more than 300, knew one another prior to entering the room, and each session lasted only 60 minutes. The questions had been selected ahead of time by the researchers, and they ranged from the frivolous, "When did you last sing to yourself?" to the profound, "If you were to die this evening with no opportunity to communicate with anyone else, what would you most regret not having told someone?" Afterward, each pair of participants went their separate ways. No one was instructed to stay in touch. However, when researchers followed up 7 weeks later, they found that 57% of them had sought out their conversational partner in the days and weeks after the experiment. 35% of participants had gotten together to socialize. One pair went to dinner and then saw a few movies and then started meeting over weekends and then on holidays. About a year later, when they got married, they invited everyone in the psych lab to the ceremony. The impact exceeded everyone's expectations, Arthur Aaron told me. Even now, I'm surprised by it. We had no idea what this would become. The Aarons had launched their study to see if there was a practical methodology for creating closeness, a technique that might generate connection. In particular, they wanted to see if it was possible to make strangers into friends. Other experiments had revealed a long list of factors that had no impact whatsoever. Researchers had learned that simply because 2 people had experiences or beliefs in common, they both went to the same church and both smoked, or they were both atheists who hated tobacco, these similarities on their own were not enough to foster camaraderie. Studies had shown that instructing people to make small talk, or do puzzles together, or tell each other jokes, were all ineffectual at creating a sense of closeness. Merely informing study participants that, quote, "We have taken great care in matching partners, and we expect that you and your partner will like one another," did not necessarily mean people would like each other at all. In fact, there was only one method the Aarons tested that could reliably help strangers form a connection. A series of 36 questions that, as Elaine and Arthur Aaron later wrote, elicited sustained, escalating, reciprocal, personalistic self-disclosure. These questions eventually became known as the Fast Friends procedure, and they grew famous among sociologists, psychologists, and readers of articles with headlines like "The 36 Questions That Lead to Love." What's particularly interesting about the Fast Friends procedure is that the 36 questions were chosen somewhat haphazardly, at least at first. Some of them came from a game named The Ungame that was popular among stoners and university students, a demographic that included more than a few of the Aarons' research assistants. Other questions were dreamed up during coffee breaks or by whoever happened to be within earshot when everyone went to a bar. There wasn't a lot of what you would call strict science in how we initially found the questions, Ed Melanat, one of the Aarons grad students, told me. We must have come up with, 200 of them, and then we would run tests until we figured out which ones worked best. The researchers assumed the best approach was to start with shallow, safe questions. Whom would you want as a dinner guest? And then slowly get to the deeper stuff. It felt weird to ask people to start bearing their souls right away, Milanette said. So we decided to start simple. By question 7, do you have a secret hunch about how you will die? People were being asked to reveal their deepest anxieties. By question 24, how do you feel about your relationship with your mother? And 29, share with your partner an embarrassing moment. Participants were being asked to describe their closest relationships and most painful memories. Question 35, of all the people in your family, whose death would you find most disturbing? Felt so intimate that participants often asked and answered it in a near whisper. The last question was open-ended. Share a personal problem and ask your partner's advice. And by then, one or both participants were frequently crying. The importance of vulnerability. As the Stony Brook team